The bucket of gray water trembled against her knee, and the woman bent on her hands at the foot of the great staircase did not lift her head when two voices crossed the landing above her. She was scrubbing the cold marble of Wexford Hall in a borrowed apron, her sleeves pushed past the elbow, her hair bound under a charwoman's cloth, and 3 feet over her bent neck. The people who owned the house spoke of her as though she were a sum to be carried down into a ledger. She kept the brush moving. She had learned across 6 days of this, that a brush in motion made a servant invisible, and that an invisible servant heard the truth a guest never would. What she heard that 7th morning she would carry out of the house with her, and it would end the thing she had come there to begin. She did not gasp. The water did not still in the pail. Only her hand for the length of one breath stopped on the stone. Her name was Beatrix Fenwick, and she was 24 years old, and in 7 days she was to have married into the family that did not know she knelt in their hall. The arrangement had been made the way such arrangements are made, among people who count carefully, across a polished table, between her father and a man with a viscount's coronet stitched into his world and almost nothing left in his coffers. The wool trade had built the Fenwick fortune across 3 plain generations, and a great deal of it was hers. And the family at Wexford Hall wanted that money the way a drowning man wants a thrown rope. She had understood as much from the first. She was not a girl who had mistaken the bargain for a ballad. What she had not understood, and what had driven her to the deception that put her on her knees that week, was a simpler thing. She did not know the man she was to marry. She had met Lord Aubrey Vane 4 times across crowded rooms, and each time he had been charming, and each time the charm had felt like a coat he put on at the door and took off in the carriage home. So she had done a reckless thing, a thing her late mother would have called unpardonable. She had come to Wexford Hall a fortnight early, unannounced, not as the heiress whose carriage they were airing the east rooms to receive, but as a hired char sent up from the agency in the market town to ready the house for a wedding. The heiress the household believed was not expected until the Saturday. The plain woman scrubbing the stairs was nobody, and nobody, Beatrix had discovered, was the freest person in any great house in England. 6 days of being nobody had taught her a great deal, and it matters for everything that came after. So, hold it as she held it. It had taught her the names of the under-housemaids and the weight of a full coal scuttle, and the particular ache that settles into the small of the back by the 3rd hour of kneeling. It had taught her that the cook, a broad, kind woman named Mrs. Tyndall, fed the boot boy extra, because his own family could not, and that the head footman skimmed the cellar wine and blamed the damp. It had taught her above all that you learn a house through its floors, and you learn a family through the things they say above the heads of the people cleaning them. She rose from the staircase when the voices had passed on toward the breakfast room, and she carried her bucket down the service passage with her heart going hard against her stays. What she had overheard was not yet a whole shape in her mind. It was fragments, 2 words, and then a laugh, and then a number, and she needed to set them in order before she let herself believe them. She set the bucket in the scullery and pressed her raw hands flat against the cold stone of the sink, and made herself remember it exactly, word by word, the way her father had taught her to remember the terms of a contract. The first voice had been Lord Aubrey's light, amused, the voice of a man who found most things slightly beneath his notice. The second had been older and drier, and she had not at once known it, for she had heard it only once before, on the day she arrived, issuing orders to a maid through a half-open door. It belonged to the Dowager Viscountess, Lady Sabine Vane, the mother, the widow who had run Wexford Hall as her own kingdom for 11 years, and meant to go on running it through her son's marriage, as she had run it through her son's minority. What they had said above her bent and scrubbing back was this. Lord Aubrey had said the Fenwick girl was duller than he remembered, and his mother had answered that it did not signify, that he need only be civil through the wedding breakfast and tolerable through the wedding night, and that afterward the settlement would see to the rest. He had asked, in the tone of a man asking the hour, how soon the rest might be seen to, and Lady Sabine had laughed, and she had said the thing Beatrix would hear in her sleep for a long while after. She had said that the second clause gave the estate the management of the whole of the wife's portion within the year, and that the physician at Bramble Court was a discreet man who had certified delicate ladies into the country before, and that a wife who proved nervous and unwell could be made comfortable a long way from town, while her husband enjoyed his health. A wife made comfortable a long way from town? A discreet physician? A second clause she had never read. She stood in the scullery a long time. Outside the small, high window, the autumn light fell thin and gold across the kitchen yard, and a stable lad whistled, and the ordinary morning of the house went on. The settlement her father's solicitor had drafted, the one she had read with her own eyes, held no such clause, which meant the clause she had just heard describe lived in a different settlement, which meant the document she was to sign on Saturday was not the document she believed it to be. She did not weep, she found. To her own surprise, that she was not even afraid, not yet. What rose in her instead was a cold and steady attention, the same attention her grandfather was said to have brought to a bale of wool he suspected of being packed wet at the center. She would have to see the paper. She would have to read the second clause with her own eyes, and she had 6 days, and a charwoman's apron, and the strange wide freedom of being nobody. The land steward found her in the muniment passage that afternoon, and that was the first time she truly looked at Gideon Hartle. She had seen him about the house the way one sees furniture. He was a tall man, somewhere near 35, lean and quiet, with the weathered brown skin of a man who spent his days out of doors, and a stillness about him that the other servants gave room to. He wore a plain dark coat, and not livery, for a steward stood above the household and below the family, in that uneasy middle country, and he carried a ring of keys at his belt that the housekeeper herself deferred to. The maid said he had been a soldier. The maid said a great many things. What Beatrix noticed when he came upon her standing too long outside the locked door of the room where the estate papers were kept was that he did not bark at her to move along. He looked at her once, with gray eyes the color of a cold hearth, and asked her what she was about. She told him she was lost. It was a poor lie, and they both knew it, for no servant who had been 6 days in a house was lost in the muniment passage. He went on looking at her. Then he unlocked the door, and stood aside, and said the room wanted dusting, and had wanted it a month, and that she might as well make herself useful since she had found her way there. He said it in the level voice of a man stating a fact. He did not smile. He had given her the room all the same, and they both knew that too. She dusted the muniment room for an hour while he sat at the long table working through a column of figures, and neither of them spoke. And the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the first hour of that whole strange week. She had not felt entirely alone. When she reached up to wipe the high shelf where the deed boxes stood in their rows, her sleeve fell back from her wrist, and she saw him see her hand. Not raw with a lifetime of work, that hand soft under its new blisters. A lady's hand. He said nothing. He set down his pen and looked at his figures again, and after a moment he said, in the same level tone, that the box on the third shelf, the one bound in red, held the marriage settlements, and that it was kept locked, and that the dowager carried the only key. He had told her exactly where to look. She did not understand. Then, why? What she could not have known, kneeling in the dust with her heart loud in her ears, was that Gideon Hartle had a quarrel with that locked box of his own. He had been born a gentleman. His father and the old Viscount had been cousins, and a small competence had been left to him in a will, a few hundred a year, and a cottage, with good land enough for a soldier home from the wars, to live as a modest, independent man. The competence had passed through Lady Sabine's hands during his years abroad, and when he came home, wounded and weary, he had found the cottage let to another, and the income gone, and a sheaf of papers that said, in language he could not unpick, that he had signed it all away before he marched. He had not signed it. He knew he had not signed it. He had taken the steward's place at Wexford Hall for a single reason, which was to stay near that box bound in red until he understood how the thing had been done to him. He had been waiting 3 years. He had grown patient the way stone grows patient. And then a charwoman with a lady's hands had stood outside the muniment door, looking at the box as though it had robbed her too. The dismissive word for Beatrix moved through the household that same week, and she heard it first from the lips of the housekeeper, Mrs. Locksley, in the privacy of the still room where the maids could not carry it. The trade bride, Mrs. Takis, Locksley called her, meaning the heiress, meaning the woman whose carriage was coming on Saturday, not dreaming she spoke it to the woman herself. A trade bride buying a coronet with her father's wool money, the housekeeper said, and not even pretty enough to make it a fair exchange. The maid she said it to laughed behind her hand. Beatrix, scrubbing the still room flags, kept her face down and her brush moving, and felt the words settle on her like the gray water settling into the cracks of the stone. 3 days now until the carriage was due. The carriage that was meant to bring her, and she had not yet found a way into that locked box. She lay awake on her narrow servant's bed beneath the eaves, and turned the problem the way her father turned a difficult debt. The dowager carried the only key. The dowager did not part with it. The dowager, however, as Beatrix had learned in her days of watching, took her chocolate in the morning room at 9:30 each day, and was not to be disturbed. And her keys hung from a chatelaine at her waist except for the 1 hour of the week when the household accounts were reconciled, and the steward came to her sitting room with his ledgers, and the keys were laid upon the table between them, so the deed boxes might be opened, and the rents checked against the deeds. The accounts were reconciled on Thursdays. Saturday was the wedding. Thursday was her last chance, and the steward held it in his hands without knowing it, or so she believed. On the Thursday morning, Beatrix contrived to be the maid who carried the coal up to the dowager's sitting room. It cost her a 6 to the girl whose task it rightly was, and a story about wanting to see the fine rooms, and the girl took the coin and asked no questions. So it was that Beatrix Fenwick knelt at the grate in the dowager's sitting room, building up a fire she did not need to build, when Gideon Hartle came in with his ledgers under his arm and Lady Sabine laid her ring of keys upon the table. The dowager did not look at the girl at the grate. That was the whole of the household's blindness, distilled into a single moment. Lady Sabine Vane, who missed nothing that signified, who could price a gown across a ballroom and read a debt in a man's collar, did not see the woman 6 feet from her elbow, because the woman wore an apron and held a coal scuttle, and people who held coal scuttles were not people. She opened the strong box herself and drew out a folded document and spread it upon the table and told the steward, in a voice gone suddenly low, that this was the one to be witnessed on Saturday, and that the other, the one the girl's father had sent, was to be kept in the box and shown to no one, and burned the moment the ink was dry on the true one. 2 settlements. One for the bride to believe in, one for her to sign. Beatrix's hand stayed steady on the coal. She had the proof now, or nearly. What she did not have was the words of the second clause, and she could not cross the room and read them, and the dowager was already folding the paper again. It was Gideon Hartle who gave her the page. He did it so quietly that Beatrix did not at first understand what he had done. He asked the dowager in his level steward's voice whether the rents from the home farm ought to be entered against the old account or the new. And he laid his ledger open on the table beside the spread document and bent over it. And as he bent, he turned the document a quarter turn with 2 fingers, the way a man might shift a paper that stood in his light, so that for the space of half a minute it lay open and right way up toward the grate where a maid knelt at the fire. He did not look at the maid. He kept his eyes on his column of figures and asked his dull question about the home farm rents and held the paper steady in the light, and Beatrix read. She read the second clause. It gave the management of the whole of the wife's portion to her husband, and in the husband's incapacity or absence to his mother, within 12 months of the marriage, the wife to have no power to revoke. It named the sum. It named her father's bank, and at the foot of the page where her own signature was to go, a name had already been written in, witnessed and dated, a name that was meant to be hers, in a hand that was not hers at all, as though the thing were already half done and wanted only her living body in the room to make it law. Her father's solicitor had drafted no such clause. She had been forged onto a paper that would have buried her alive in the country with a discreet physician and a husband enjoying his health. the grate swam in front of her. She set the last lump of coal in place with a hand that did not shake, because she would not give them the satisfaction even unwitnessed, and she rose and bobbed her servant's bob and carried her empty scuttle out of the room, and in the passage she stood against the cold wall and breathed. When she lifted her head, Gideon Hartle was there. He had followed her out on some steward's pretext, and he stood looking down at her with those cold hearth eyes, and for the first time something moved behind them. He said her name. Not the name she had given the agency. He said low that her hands were not a char's hands, and her speech was not a char's speech, and that he had known for 3 days she was no more a servant than he was, and that he thought now he knew who she was. He said that if she meant to do anything about what she had read, she had until Saturday, and that a forged settlement was a hanging matter for whoever drew it, and that the dowager knew that better than anyone, and would not let the thing be taken from her without a fight. Beatrix looked up at the steward who had turned the paper into the light for her. She asked him why he had done it. And Gideon Hartle, who had waited 3 years in patience like stone, told her about his own competence, the cottage, with the good land, the signature he had never written, in a few plain sentences with no self-pity in them, and she understood that they had both been robbed by the same hand and the same locked box, and that he had been waiting all this while for someone who could read the thing he could not. What neither of them had reckoned with was how quickly the dowager moved when she sensed the ground shift beneath her. She had not seen the maid at the grate. She had felt, though with the old instinct that had kept Wexford Hall hers for 11 years, that her steward lingered too long in the muniment passage and spoke too gently to a char. And Lady Sabine Vane did not wait to understand a danger before she answered it. By the Friday morning, the agency char who had been 6 days in the house was dismissed without a character, turned out at the kitchen door with her week's wages, short by 2 days, on the housekeeper's word that silver had gone missing from the still room. It was a clean stroke. A dismissed servant accused of theft had no voice that any magistrate would hear, and a woman with no character could lay no charge against a viscountess that would not curl back upon herself. The dowager had not needed to know who Beatrix was in order to silence her. She had needed only to make her nobody, in fact, as she had been, nobody in disguise. Beatrix walked out of the kitchen yard of Wexford Hall on the Friday morning, with her bundle under her arm, and the gold autumn light hard in her eyes, and for the first time that week she was afraid. The forged settlement lay locked in the strongbox. The witnessed false signature waited for Saturday. She could go to her father, but her father was 3 days' journey distant, and the wedding was the next morning. And the carriage that was meant to bring the heiress already stood, she knew, harnessed and waiting at the posting inn in the market town with her own maid and her own boxes, ready to roll up the Wexford Drive at 11 and deliver the bride to the trap. Even if she reached the inn and took her own place, she would be walking into a house that meant to bury her, with no witness but a dismissed char's word against a viscountess and her son. She sat on a milestone at the edge of the Wexford land, and let herself for one moment want to weep. Then a step on the road behind her. Gideon Hartle came down toward her leading 2 horses, with his own dismissal in his pocket, for he had resigned his stewardship the hour he learned she had been turned out, and the ring of keys was gone from his belt. Not all of them. He had kept one. He had kept it for 3 years against this very morning. It was the duplicate of the key to that box bound in red, cut in secret in his first year at Wexford. From a wax impression he had taken the one time the dowager left her chatelaine on the table, and he had never used it, because a man who could not read the law could not use the law, and he had been waiting for a reader. Here was the shape of it. Then the 2 of them, on the road with the wedding, a night away. Beatrix could read what the box held and could not reach it. Gideon could reach the box, and could not read it. Apart, each of them was nobody. Together, they were the only 2 people in England who could open that strongbox and understand what they found inside. They did not steal the false settlement. Beatrix would not have it said ever that she had won her freedom by a theft. And besides, a stolen paper proved nothing but the theft. What they did instead, in the gray hours before the Saturday dawn, was harder. Gideon let them both back into the silent house through the steward's door. He still knew how to work, and they went to the muniment room, and with the duplicate key he opened the strong box, and Beatrix lifted out the two settlements and laid them side by side on the long table in the light of a single shielded candle. She read them both end to end, in a low, steady voice, while Gideon held the candle and watched the passage door. She copied the false second clause out in full in her own hand, every word, and the forged signature with its false witness and its false date, and noted the bank and the sum, and sealed her copy and the comparison into a letter to her father's solicitor, and gave it to Gideon to ride south with at first, light, fast, ahead of any pursuit. Then she put both original settlements back into the box exactly as she had found them, and locked it, and let the candle die. She would not run. That was the thing she settled in herself that night. Kneeling once more on the cold muniment floor, this time of her own choosing. She would not be the heiress who fled and let them say she had jilted a viscount in a fit of nerves. A delicate lady gone nervous and unwell, the very tale they had written for her in advance. She would walk up the Wexford Drive on Saturday in her own carriage and her own name and her own gown, and she would let them spring the trap before every witness they had gathered to dignify it, and she would break it in front of them all. For there was one thing the dowager's careful plan required that the dowager could not forge, and that was the bride's own hand setting the bride's own name to the page, freely, before witnesses. Without that signature, the forged paper was only a hanging matter, waiting to be discovered. The dowager needed her to sign, and Beatrix had decided that she would not. The wedding morning came up clear and cold and gold over Wexford Hall, and the carriage that was meant to deliver the trade bride to her burial rolled up the drive at 11, and out of it stepped a woman the household had last seen on her knees at the foot of the great staircase, in an apron with her hair under a cloth. Beatrix Fenwick came up the steps of Wexford Hall in dove-grey silk, with her father's pearls at her throat and her chin level, and she watched the recognition move across the housekeeper's face and across the head footman's, and she said nothing of it. And neither did they, because there was nothing any of them could say. The signing was to be done in the long gallery before the wedding itself, the way such things were done, with the witnesses gathered, the family solicitor present, the local rector, two neighboring gentlemen of standing, and the dowager in claret silk and her diamond seated at the head of the long table where the red box already stood open. Lord Aubrey Vane stood by the window in his wedding coat, handsome and bored, the charm already buttoned on. He came forward and bowed over Beatrix's hand and said something light about how well she looked, and she let him say it, and she felt nothing for him at all. Not even anger, only the cold, clear attention of a woman reading a wet bale. Lady Sabine had the false settlement spread upon the table. Beatrix saw it from across the room, the forged second clause, the false signature already inked at the foot, waiting only for her living hand to come and stand beside it and make the lie true. The dowager smiled at her, a warm and gracious smile, and bid her come and sign, and held out the pen. Beatrix did not take the pen. She crossed the long gallery in the silence of all those gathered eyes, and stopped at the table and looked down at the paper for a long moment, so that every person in the room saw her read it. Then she lifted her head and said in a voice pitched to carry to the far end of the gallery that this was not the settlement her father had drafted, that a second clause had been added giving her whole fortune into this family's keeping within the year, with no power in her to revoke it, and that a signature had been forged at the foot of it in her name, witnessed and dated, before she had so much as entered the house. She said it plainly, the way a merchant states the terms of a contract, with no tremor and no flourish. Then she laid her own copy of the false clause upon the table beside the original, in her own hand, and invited the family solicitor and the two gentlemen and the rector to compare the forged signature with her true one, which she signed then and there upon a blank sheet for all of them to watch, and to compare both with the settlement her father had sent, which lay, she said, in the red box at the dowager's own elbow, and which the dowager had ordered burned the moment the false one was signed. The gallery was very quiet. The rector reached for the red box. Lady Sabine Vane did not fragment all at once. She was made of harder stuff than that. She rose from her chair with her diamonds catching the cold morning light, and said in a voice gone smooth as poured glass that the girl was overwrought, that this was precisely the nervous delicacy they had all feared in a bride raised in trade, that no forgery had occurred, and the second clause was a standard provision the girl in her agitation had misread, and that the kindest course was to send for the physician at Bramble Court who attended the family in such distresses. It was a masterstroke, and Beatrix felt the room waver toward it, for the dowager was a viscountess and Beatrix was wool money, and the easiest thing for every gentleman in that gallery to believe was that a bride had taken a fit of nerves. It was Gideon Hartle who came through the gallery door, then mud to the knee, the dawn's hard ride still on him, and behind him the gray-faced clerk of her father's own solicitor, summoned by the letter that had gone south, ahead of the pursuit and met the solicitor already on the northern road. For her father, it transpired, had grown uneasy about the settlement himself and sent his man up early. The clerk carried the true draft, the original kept in the solicitor's own office, and laid it on the table beside the forged one, and the two gentlemen and the rector bent over the three papers together, and the comparison took less than a minute because a forgery is a clumsy thing held up beside the genuine article. And the false witness named at the foot of the forged signature was a man. One of the neighboring gentlemen knew to have been in Bath the whole of the week the document was dated. Lady Sabine said her son's name once, sharply, as though calling him to her defense, and Lord Aubrey, who had wanted only to be charming and comfortable and rich, looked at the three papers and looked at his mother, and said nothing at all, and his silence was the first honest thing Beatrix had ever known him to do. The dowager said the girl's name. Then the trade bride, the word she had used in the still room without dreaming who heard it, and she said it again, and a third time, smaller with each saying, and the warm, gracious mask did not so much break as simply cease, leaving an old woman standing among her diamonds in a cold gallery with a forged paper at her hand, and every gentleman in the room now looking at her the way one looks at a debt one has decided not to honor. Beatrix did not gloat. She had promised herself she would not, and she did not. When the rector asked her gravely what she wished to do, she said only that there would be no wedding, that the forged settlement and the forged signature were matters for the law if her father chose to pursue them, and that for her own part she wished only to leave the house and never to return to it. She said it without heat. She had come to learn the man she was to marry, and she had learned him, and the learning was complete, and there was nothing in it to rage about, only a great deal to be done with. There was one thing more, and she did it before she left the gallery. She turned to the dowager who stood unmoving and said in a quieter voice, meant for fewer ears, that she knew of a competence that had passed through this family's hands some years before, a small inheritance with a cottage and good land that had belonged to a soldier abroad, and a signature on that paper, too, that the soldier had never written, and that the same gentleman now gathered might be interested to compare that hand as well. She did not say Gideon's name. She did not need to. She watched the dowager understand that the box bound in red held more than one forgery, and that the same patient comparison that had broken the false settlement would break the false competence too, and that the steward she had robbed was the one who had ridden south for the letter that ruined her. The dowager sat down. It was the only thing left for her to do. Beatrix Fenwick walked out of Wexford Hall for the second time that week, and this time she walked out the front door, in dove-gray silk, down the great staircase she had scrubbed on her knees, and at the foot of it Gideon Hartle waited, with the mud of the road still on him, and he offered her his arm. They did not speak much on the steps. There was a great deal that did not need saying between two people who had each spent years being made nobody, and had made themselves in a single gray dawn, the only two who could not be ignored. The matter of the law took the winter to resolve, and it was resolved quietly, as such things are among people who can afford discretion and fear scandal more than justice. The forged settlement never came before a court for the family, fearing the rope that hung over a proven forgery settled rather than be tried, and part of the settling was the restoration of a soldier's competence, the cottage with the good land returned, the income restored. The false witness, who had sworn to a signature written in Bath, quietly persuaded to leave the county. An old wrong made right without a word of it reaching the newspapers. Beatrix's father came north when the worst was over, a stout, grave man who had counted in wool all his life, and he read every line of the settling himself before he would put his name to it. And he said only, when it was done, that he had trusted lawyers his whole life, and would trust his daughter's eyes instead from that day forward. Lord Aubrey married a different fortune within the year, a quieter girl who never learned how near she had come to his mother's red box, and Beatrix did not envy her, and did not warn her, for she had learned that the world's verdicts must be witnessed before they can be overturned, and she had no standing to witness in another woman's house. She did not go straight home to her father. She went first with her own maid for propriety, and her own carriage, and her own name fully restored, to a cottage with good land at the edge of the Wexford country, to see it given back into the hands of the man it belonged to. It was a plain stone house, with autumn light, lying gold across its threshold, and a hearth that had stood cold 3 years, and was lit now. Gideon Hartle stood in the doorway of the home that had been taken from him and given back, and he was not, in that moment, a steward or a soldier, or a man who had waited like stone. He was only a man home at last, and when he turned and looked at the woman who had read the paper, he could not read. The cold hearth gray of his eyes was not cold at all. He said her name, her own name, the true one. The first time in open air, with no apron between them, and no candle, and no danger, Beatrix. He said he had nothing to offer her, that the world would think enough, a few hundred a year in a cottage and a soldier's bad shoulder, and that she had more money than he would see in 10 lifetimes, and that he knew, exactly, how that looked. And Beatrix Fenwick, who had been bought and sold across a polished table by men who counted carefully, looked at the one man who had given her a thing she could not be made to sign away, looked at the page turned into the light, the door unlocked, the long, patient silence that had asked nothing of her at all. And she told him she had spent a week learning the difference between a man who wanted what she had and a man who saw what she was, and that she had married no one yet, and did not intend to marry anyone who counted carefully ever again. They were married in the spring, in the small gray church on the Wexford road, with Mrs. Nari, Tyndall the cook in her best bonnet, and the boot boy scrubbed pink, and the under-housemaids she had once knelt beside, all there in the pews, for they were her people. Now, in a way, the long gallery never could have been. There was no settlement read aloud, and no red box, and no second clause. There was only a plain ring, and a plain man, and a woman who walked up the aisle of her own free will, signing her own name to her own life, in front of witnesses who knew her, all of them, for exactly who she was. That first evening in the cottage, with the fire lit and the spring dusk coming down green and soft outside the small windows, Beatrix took off her gloves and looked at her hands. The blisters had long healed. A faint roughness lingered across the palms, even so, one that had never quite gone, a memory of gray water, and a scrubbing brush in the foot of a great, cold staircase, and she found she did not want it gone. She held her hands out to the fire, the hands that had been a lady's and a char's, and were now her own, and Gideon took one of them in his, the rough palm against his rougher one, and neither of them said anything, because there are some warmths that do not need to be spoken to be understood. If Beatrix's week on her knees left you anything worth carrying out of this house, perhaps it is only this, and then the story will let you go. The world will tell a woman what she is worth in rooms where she has not been asked to speak, and the world will be wrong, and the only verdict that finally signifies is the one rendered by the person who troubled to see her plainly. She had gone into that great house to learn a man, and she had come out of it having learned the difference between being counted and being seen, and she spent the rest of her long life on the right side of it, in a plain stone cottage with good land and a hearth, long since made warm. Outside the window, the last of the spring light went out of the green, and the fire settled, and somewhere off across the dark land a stable lad was whistling the same tune she had heard on her first frightened morning at the scullery sink, and this time she was not afraid, and this time the house was hers.